while I hate the term slam poetry because I think people consider it to be a limiting term and they say, well, I'm not a slam poet, I can't enter a poetry slam, I do think that there is such a thing as slam style.
Undeniably, there are generic conventions that have attached themselves to slam as a form of poetry, just as much as anything else.
How do I describe it? It's go for it poetry. It's like, it's emotional, it gets people going, you should get going.
For me, I feel like a slam poem is something that's making a point, is making it like not forcefully, but is forceful in some way. Like it's saying, listen to me, I have this to say and I'm gonna say it this way and you're gonna listen. I've always said like a good slam poem makes you feel like you've just been punched in the gut.
It'll be a 3-minute poem whether it needs to be or not. It will usually have something to do with a leftist kind of progressive agenda about equality or sexism or racism or capitalism or lots of isms.
It's thrived in a context that favours radically current subject material, frequently quite socially or politically engaged.
It has to be something that is very loud, very possible for somebody to pick up on at first listening.
A slam poem is one that will have an immediate impact on the audience because that's then when they're going to hold up scorecards. So whether it's really, really funny, whether it just has a particularly powerful ending line, whether it's about an emotive topic, there are certain things that tend to pop up.
It's just a case of presenting something that's very pacey and very kind of fast and furious in a lot of ways. It's kind of wham bam thank you man, kind of like that sort of thing.
There's not a definite line which you can by which you can discern slam poem versus not a slam poem, but I think there are certain, say, conventions and styles of performing poetry.
It's a convenient shorthand. Oh, it's a very slammy poem. It'll be impactful. It'll have it'll be obvious what it's about by the end of it.
It's a loud poetry. Even the quiet slam poems, they say something, they point at you, and they make you react.
Mum, I'm really sorry. I'm sorry for all the times I walked into roads without looking. I'm sorry you know me well that I can't pretend I've got a predisposition to position myself with intuition. You know better. Me and the traffic, Mum. We go hell for leather. I'm sorry that the last time I called I had to tell you that 4 days before my housemates found me on the lip of the river, looking down into the throat, into the reality of drowning. I know I was feet first sliding into the reality of fear, Mum, but the deadening of the nerve endings felt like all those times when you dashed across 2 cities to see me, swept me up, took me home and asked me what set my neurons alight this time. It felt like muttling everything down to a hushed concern. It felt like the river just wanted to know if I was okay, Mum, and I just wanted to tell it the truth.
I think there is starting to become more of a trend towards trying to write for a slam style, which I don't think is a great thing because I think the power of poetry is its diversity and its individual expressionism. And I think that style is very kind of attempting to move out towards the audience and draw them in rather than kind of giving them the opportunity and the option to listen to you.
I think sometimes poetry slams can lose a bit of that authenticity, a bit of that consideration in actually making meaning in what you're saying.
It kind of jars me that this East Coast kind of version of poetry has now kind of become the US version, which is now becoming all the English language versions. And I get that that's most people's first exposure to it in terms of kind of YouTube and social media and things like that, but there has to be a step away from that because then it becomes about emulating voices rather than finding our own.
We have people slamming through all ages in Oxford, and you get lots of different styles, and that to me is much more interesting than just hearing that same old rhythm and the intonation and that little tick where people take the sentence up to the beginning of the next one, you know, and I'm like, oh, come on, where's your voice? Where's your voice? That's what's important to me.
It's so culturally specific. I mean, US slam style is often this political, highly personal, confessional, performative poem. In Germany, the time limit is 7 minutes and they prefer comedy. So when we talk about slam style, I think we have to be really conscious of the fact that it is culturally variable.
There is a subgenre. I find it more exciting when people break away from that, but also I think to just write off anyone who falls into a similar kind of, not a trap, but a similar kind of pattern is a bit unfair because it's often a place where people are just getting started.
I don't think a lot of people just write for slams. I don't think that's actually a thing. I just think that because slams exist and because it's a way to get yourself noticed, you will put more emphasis on your work that you know will do well in slams.
Slams are open to any style of poetry, technically. You could get up there and read a perfect sonnet from a piece of paper and it would be valid, but you wouldn't win.
In a slam, it's like if you're not ticking those audience-pleasing boxes, people switch off because it seems like it's against the format of a slam.
A lot of people say, yeah, go to a slam, do whatever poetry you want. Don't worry if it's not loud or, you know, one that gets people riled up. I'd say don't listen to that. I'd say go to a slam and do a slam poem.
I've woken up 3 times this week. Same dream, same restless sleep, same unknown skyscraper tall its shadow holds me. Same 4-year-old you I wake up to. Dream-filled, question-filled, full for dinner but not for pudding, mother's side I learned well. You giver of umbrellas to rainbows, you who learns first lessons under roofs made of treetops. The potential is a galaxy. When I dream of you. I dream my skin is a bulletproof vest I cannot give to you, and we are living in a war zone, and today for you is the first day that war broke, and up until today I could answer all your questions, but today your footsteps were a threat. Your posture was a man wielding a knife. You are 13. How do I tell you your footsteps are still sunshine? Question 1, why did they stop me, Dad?
Part of writing poetry is figuring out where your poetry is best served to be. And slam is a particular form where it is loud, it is metaphorically grabbing someone by the neck and shouting something in their face. And yeah, I think there are people who are slam poets or see themselves as slam poets. You know, their poetry will work in other places, but it's primarily built for slam and it works in slam and it's good.
I think there is someone that sort of can fall into a trap of being a slam poet. There are cleverer and more, I guess, talented people that sort of stay out of the format. I think when we say slam poetry, there's the format of, I think, a certain level of energy of performance. There's always someone that's a good performer, but when they go into sort of the very high levels of territory when it comes to energy and a little bit more gestures than normal, that's always a little bit more animated. I think that's always going to do well for a slam poet.
So I don't know, I don't know what a slam poet is, innit? But when you see a slam poet, you know that they're a slam poet.
I think some people do call themselves slam poets and say, you know, this is a slam poem, but yeah, it's something that I've been trying to figure out myself.
The idea of a slam poet, I think it does happen. You become in that box because you practice those poems the most, because you become competitive. I think a lot of people do become competitive, whether they like to admit it or not.
Do you, innit? Like, if that's what you want to do, if that's how you want to make your living, or that's just how you enjoy writing poetry, then fair enough. But in terms of like poets and being a poet, I feel like there's so much more to be done with poetry and to be done with the art form, that if you're a good slam poet and if you're a slam poet that's winning slams, that means you could be doing so much more with the art form and with your performance and with everything that you're doing.
I think often people go forward from the 3-minute spoken word poem, slam poem, and try, you know, hour-long solo shows and try, you know, collaborative poems and try all these other things.
I don't know, this is controversial. I'm gonna say that there is a slam poet. I'm not gonna say that's the only way you can introduce yourself, right? Like, I am a daughter and I am a sister. Like, I can be both, right? I think you can say, but you can introduce yourself as I am a slam poet. That's absolutely fine. If that's how you want to identify yourself, if that's something that you really enjoy doing, if teaching is your life, you're allowed to introduce yourself as I'm a teacher. That makes a ton of sense to me.
I guess there are slam poets if a poet is only performing at slams. But other than that, I think it's a way of learning your craft. I think it's a very good way of doing that, because you're going to be doing shorter pieces, you're going to have to really kind of hone your skills, you're going to have to make sure you are totally on the ball. Not kind of, you know, there's nothing wrong with, you know, presenting a piece that you've written that day that you're stumbling to read and whatever, that's fine. There's a time and a place for that. But I think in a slam, you have to go all out if you are in it to win it.
I do think there is such a thing as a slam poet. I
don't necessarily think it's either a good or a bad thing. I think it's just a different form of poetry. It's about trying to elicit the biggest reaction you can out of the audience.
I do believe there is a slam poet, but not everyone is correctly identified as one. So from people outside the poetry scene, anyone that kind of gets on stage and does performed poetry is referred to as a slam poet. And then performed poetry is referred to as slam poetry, even though that's not accurate. That's incorrect.
I believe there's people who see themselves as slam poets. You see some people and they have a lot of poems about the same topic, and they're really good. No, they are really good poems, but you can see it's trying to perfect. It looks oftentimes like a perfection process towards a slam poem.
I think you can see some poets that definitely that there is a kind of a style that they kind of are aspiring to as being kind of a gold standard again, and I think that kind of goes back to, can you have a gold standard, a sort of set idea of what is the best type of poem to have, and maybe you can, maybe you can't. And it probably, yeah, I think it is always going to depend on context. It's always going to depend on the type of poem you're doing. But yeah, I think you can see poets that kind of have their eye on a prize, I guess.
There are people who will try and tailor their work more for a slam. So they will do stuff that is more about including the audience, because they're no longer just writing for themselves. If they're trying to write for slams, they're going to be considering what's going to make the audience react, what's going to get me more points.
I don't think I'm a slam poet because I don't always write like that. You know, I have quiet pieces and long pieces and short pieces and pieces about love and my family that I wouldn't do in a slam because they're not that gut punch. They're just my little like ambling stroll kind of a poem.
The logo on our blazers was this golden lion. And in our first ever assembly, our head teacher told us that we would grow from spotty cubs into full-maned men, ready to seize the world at 16, ready to take a mate from the girls' school next door, as nature had intended. I knew of only one who admitted to not wanting this, and he was reduced to carcass. The smell of his blood in the playground served as a warning. This was not that kind of pride.
I think some people choose to define themselves as a slam poet, and I think that is interesting because then you find out about different parts of them. So looking at the Americans, someone like Andrea Gibson or Denez Smith or Denise Frohman, like people who I came to through their performances in national or world slams, have excellent bodies of printed work. And that is not as well known. There is a version of a slam poet, someone who writes list poems and has open letters and is political, and all of those are great. But you then compare that to the fact that they are a dimensioned artist with a lot of other things going on to them.
Personally, I suppose as a person who reads poetry or as a critic, I would suggest that nobody ever belongs entirely to a genre. You can have a foot in it, you borrow conventions from it inescapably, because whenever you can't avoid engaging with the tradition in which you're performing any more than a swimmer in a pool can avoid disturbing the water. It's the medium in which you live and move and have your being. But that kind of participation, I remember reading Mikhail Bakhtin as a student and finding this idea that participation is not the same thing as belonging. You never belong entirely to a genre, and neither should you aim to.
I read a headline that referred to certain politicians being born into their role. So that made me think about what kind of a childhood that would then lead to. No one knows this. In playground fights, he always started it. Never boxed with his own fist, but puppeteer pointing fingers packed a punch, a red leather briefcase boxed his packed lunch. At home, his mouth hung with questions. Mum, what happens when we die? Will I go to heaven? Yes, dear, after the by-election. Don't talk with your heart full. One half-hearted hashed-out promise a day keeps harmful headlines at bay. Your room is a state and I am not your secretary. They weren't big on birthdays, but he couldn't wait to get to number 10. The party was less treasure hunt with friends, more See, with Hunt at the Treasury, he was told, mind your PMQs. He got braces to wear under suits.
No, I don't think there's a thing as a slam poet. There's poems which are more geared towards slam formats, and there's, you know, because in the same way there's subjects that are more accessible for slams.
I don't think a slam poet exists. I think that there are people who enter poetry slams.
So I don't think there's such a thing as a slam poet. I think it's a really unnuanced view of poetry which sees particular aspects as conducive to a homogenization of poetry.
There's no such thing as a slam poet or slam poem. And I think the idea that there is one only serves to put people off competing.
No, I don't believe slam poetry exists. I've seen a range of poems win slams. I've seen funny poems win slams. I've seen emotional heartbreak poetry win slams. From my personal experience, I think it's whatever connects with the audience that day.
Yeah, the slam poet doesn't exist. Like, for the longest time I didn't think I was a slam poet, and then I won a slam and I got to compete at nationals in Scotland, so yeah, I don't think the slam poet exists.
Poetry, obviously, because we are so integrated and because obviously we feed off of each other, you are always going to have certain aspects which, in the same way that like you take certain mannerisms or phrases from people you hang out with on a regular basis, and I think that's all it is.
I think there's a conception that it's just political poetry that wins slams. I think maybe because that tends to be delivered in a bit of a stronger way, but my personal experience is I don't think that the slam syndrome, as they call it, is real. I think if it connects with the audience, then you'll get the votes, personally.
See, I've been called a slam poet a lot because I've done a lot of slams. And I've done slams, I've done slams in Australia, London, Cambridge, Oxford, and New York. And after all that, people were like, okay, she's a slam poet. So Maddie Godfrey slam poet is like a big thing that happened to my bio and how I was described. And for a while, I sort of didn't fight it because I was like, okay, that's true. Like, I am doing slams. I am doing quite well at slams. Therefore, I am a slam poet. But it has this really negative connotation in the scene where people say like, oh, she's just a slam poet. And I'm like, well, so now I don't really claim the label slam poet because I believe and I'm aware that my poetry can exist in domains that aren't competitive and still can stand its own on a page or in a quiet way or in a pub or a bar or a festival, as well as a slam.
No, I'm going to say no. I think that almost any poet could decide to write a poem. It's about the poem rather than the poet, I think. You could decide to write a poem that fits into a 3-minute slot or a 4-minute slot, and it's particularly hard-hitting and put all your energy into that. It's doable. It's not something that I do, but it's doable. And if I set out to do it, I'm sure I can manage. I just don't want to, really.
I am not a slam poet. Chapter 1! I am not a slam poet. I was not birthed onto the stage, nor was I a phoenix flapping image wings as my fiery tongue burned your ears. I am not a political rant in human form. I am not liberal enough to labour you with opinions I haven't matured into potent propaganda dressed in standards, nor have I lived long enough that I can potentially bluff any of that stuff, so I'll conserve those thoughts for now. Chapter 2. I am not American. Sorry, Amy. I am not American, nor is my accent influenced by them. It remains mine with no twang added to it. Emphasis is rarely used and shouts are few and far between them. Whilst, yes, I have used Icarus wings to fly across the blue, I've never gotten that close to their sun, and whilst I have swum in YouTube videos of Def Jam and button poetry, I've not swallowed enough of their water that I've been suffocated by their verses. Chapter 3. I am not dramatic. I am not one enough of my poem to act it out, nor even free enough for me to fully perform. Chapter 4. I need to rehearse my art better and plan where to go and not drop in random rhymes so sublime it'll stick like classroom chewing gum in the back of your mind. I need better lines. Chapter 6. No. Chapter 5. I make mistakes. My humanity is apparent and omnipotence is not a talent I possess, so chapter 7 or 6. I don't believe there's a slam poet. I don't believe there's a performance poet, a written poet, a poet who only performs on a Monday. I believe in poetry. I believe in the person working part-time using all their breaks to prepare for their next open mic. I believe in poetry. In the person who takes pictures of landscapes that they call poetic. I believe in poetry. And people who share all their events via Facebook, like Boomerang Club at the Pilgrim, 6:45, every day for West Fringe. I believe in poetry. And any person who chooses to follow her, him, or it in whatever way, shape, or form is simply a poet.